Thank you. Please be seated. All right, we'll go back in the record. Dr. Nye, I would just remind you that you remain under oath. Ms. Thompson, whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Your Honor. I think before the break, and during the break, we conferred with the state about Exhibit 285, and we are seeking to offer Exhibit 285 into evidence, which is Dr. Nye's CV and her report.
Any objections to 285?
Yes, based on hearsay grounds, Your Honor, and for the reasons stated earlier during our off-the-record discussion in chambers.
Just her stuff. I will take those objections under advisement. We'll continue for purposes of this examination so that we can keep moving. Go ahead, Ms. Thompson.
And, Your Honor, we have a binder of materials if the witness needs to reference them, which the state has looked at.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Dr. Nye, you were present in court for Dr. Cruz's and Dr. Hammers' testimony, is that right?
Yes.
And you've heard some testimony over the course of the last 2 days about the scientific method?
Yes.
Is the scientific method a process that you apply in your work?
Absolutely. Sorry, I heard about the description more so today from Dr. Hammers' testimony.
Now, let me ask you this. Are you familiar with something called a biomechanical investigation?
Yes, absolutely.
What is that?
It's a scientific investigation to often determine the mechanical cause of an injury and if and how it relates to a specific event.
Do you apply the scientific method when you perform a biomechanical investigation?
Yes, absolutely.
And I don't want to, without going into detail, can you just tell us briefly what the steps are that you follow when you perform a biomechanical investigation?
Sure, yes. Just like all of us have taken in elementary school, if you remember back to your days of science, the scientific method is a foundational methodology to ensure that experiments and investigations are run so that they're repeatable and reliable. The first step is to have a hypothesis, a purpose. The next step is to develop a hypothesis or hypotheses. You can have more than one. The next step is to have materials and methods, right? So reviewing materials, gathering information, and then conducting necessary analyses to test those hypotheses. And based on the results of your analyses, then you can arrive at conclusions that then address the hypotheses that you set forth and specifically the purpose.
Dr. Nye, are you going to testify to opinions that you hold as to Mr. Mullis's case?
Yes.
And are the opinions that you're going to provide in this testimony opinions that you hold to a reasonable degree of biomechanical certainty?
Yes.
How did you first become involved in Mr. Mullis's case?
I believe that one of the attorneys for Mr. Mullis contacted Robson Forensics.
And without discussing any conclusions that you reached, what was your initial, what was the initial purpose that you were, what was the initial work that you were asked to do in this case?
Sorry, I didn't finish. Once they contacted Robson Forensics, the inquiry came in, and then I was assigned to the case.
And I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, it's okay.
I was just going to ask what you were assigned to do initially.
Okay, so so after that, we typically speak to the person that called us to determine whether or not I have the expertise that is necessary for their specific investigation. So in this case, my purpose was basically at that time to determine the mechanism of specific diagnosed injuries in Ms. Mullis.
Were you originally contacted to act as a peer reviewer for another biomechanical expert?
Initially, that's how it turned out.
Right. And did you issue a report at that stage of your involvement in this case?
Yes.
At some point, did your work in this case change?
Yes.
And how did it change?
So initially, as a peer reviewer, I'm reviewing someone else's investigation to make sure that it is technically sound, following all the steps of the scientific method, and applying the engineering and scientific principles appropriately. I don't conduct the investigation myself. I'm just overseeing, essentially, the technical aspects. When that changed was when I was asked to conduct my own independent investigation.
Is the report that you originally provided peer review on a report for someone named Dr. Susan Bully?
Yes.
And Your Honor, based on the testimony, again, we'd seek to admit Dr. Bully's report, but we would ask to defer argument on that issue, Your Honor.
Understood.
For your investigation, so not talking about the stage of this case where you were a peer reviewer, talking now about when your work in this case changed. Did you conduct a biomechanical investigation with respect to Ms. Mullis's injuries in this case?
Yes.
And you described earlier your process of conducting a biomechanical investigation. Did you follow that process in your work in this case?
Yes.
You told us step one is to identify a purpose. What was your purpose?
My purpose, initially with reviewing some basic information, was to determine whether the mechanism, or generally the forces necessary to cause Ms. Mullis's diagnosed injuries, were generated due to a swinging stabbing event, as was presented in the criminal trial transcripts that I reviewed, or whether it was due to records indicated, such as the 911 call.
Is a biomechanical investigation something that you can do on the spot?
No.
What does that process entail in terms of time?
Oh, it depends case to case. This is a very complicated case. It requires a lot of consideration and steps in reviewing case materials, the physical evidence, looking at 3D dimensional analyses, everything involved, the people, the diagnosed injuries, the implement, consideration of the spaces, the space involved, the mechanism of the injuries, scientific and medical literature review, calculations, applying scientific principles such as conservation of energy and laws of physics. It is a very arduous investigation sometimes.
I understood that from your description of your purpose that you were evaluating competing hypotheses in this case.
They weren't competing necessarily, they're just different.
But multiple
Yes.
possible hypotheses is what I meant.
Multiple proffered hypotheses, yes.
Understood. And I know that's step two of your process as you described. I want to come back to that, and I want to start with what case materials you reviewed in this case. You mentioned that you reviewed a report from Dr. Susan Bully, is that right?
Yes.
What else did you review in terms of case materials other than Dr. Bully's report?
When I conduct my own investigation, I have to review all the case materials myself. So that includes all incident information, specifically the police department documentation, photos, records, reports, interviews. As we established, I'm not a medical doctor. Therefore, I rely on the medical diagnoses set forth in the medical records. And of course, when I talk about all incident information, I'm referring to photos and documentation. So I'm looking at information that tells me what has happened in the incident because I wasn't there, and what the claims are.
Did you rely on medical materials from Dr. Kelly Cruz and Dr. Thompson in Region Medical Center?
Absolutely, yes.
Did you review any accounts from Tristan Mullis or Todd Mullis in conducting your investigation?
Sure, I reviewed, like I said, I reviewed the police documentation, and there are multiple interviews in there.
Right. Did you, in order to reach your determinations, assume that those accounts from Tristan Mullis and Todd Mullis were true or false? Or did you depend on a determination that those accounts were true or false?
No, I don't rely on that. That's why science is fundamentally based in science. It's based on physical evidence, application of physics and engineering principles, and not based on subjective accounts. Now, there's always competing witness testimony. I might do my analyses and go back and compare to what was said or stated, but I don't use that as the basis for a starting point.
Did you rely on any photos or documents from the Delaware County Sheriff's Office?
Yes.
What did you look at?
They had information regarding the shed, the rake, the clothing. They also had photos of Ms. Mullis's body, and they had, dimensions. They had dimensions of the shed as well.
Did you conduct your own inspection of Ms. Mullis's clothing?
Yes.
Meaning you yourself physically looked at it?
I myself physically looked at it, yes.
Right. Did you yourself physically look at the rake in this case?
Yes.
Did you yourself go to inspect the shed or any other buildings on the Mullis farm?
Yes, I went to visit the farm and the shed.
Did you rely on any opinions of Dr. Jennifer Hammers in reaching your conclusions?
Partly, again, a lot of her, again, the diagnosis of injuries, as we heard today, her and Dr. Cruz agree on the injury pattern.
Did you rely on any other opinions of any other experts in reaching your opinions in this case?
No, not that I can think of, no.
All right, and you said that you relied on the injury pattern in this case from Dr. Cruz and from Dr. Hammers, is that right?
Yes.
And you've heard the testimony from both of those witnesses so far about what that injury pattern was?
The testimony as well as the autopsy report, yes.
Understood. And from the testimony from Dr. Jennifer Hammers today, was the testimony that she gave today about the injury pattern on Ms. Mullis's back, did that comport with your understanding of what that injury pattern was?
Yes, it comported with what Dr. Cruz reported in her autopsy report and prior testimony.
All right. Now, you heard Dr. Hammers give some testimony about other injuries to Ms. Mullis besides these 6 wounds, wounds A to F on her back, is that right?
Yes.
Did you consider evidence about any of those other injuries on her body in reaching your opinions?
Yes, I mean, I look at all the injuries that are diagnosed on a person. However, the information provided were there are already explanations for the other injuries, so I was asked to focus on the penetration wounds.
Are you offering any opinions one way or another about any injuries on Ms. Mullis's body besides wounds A to F?
I specifically asked to focus on the penetration wounds, so that's where I spent my investigation time.
Okay. I'm going to show you, and there's been testimony about this, but so I want to briefly show you Figure A, which we've talked about earlier in these proceedings. Do you have a figure in front of you?
I do.
All right. What do you understand Figure A to represent?
Figure A is a profile view, so a side view of the basically the human torso. It doesn't have a head, doesn't have legs, doesn't have arms, and what it demonstrates is wounds A to F, the penetration, relative penetration depth relative to each other, as well as the orientation. When I say orientation, I mean the trajectories through the body.
And I want to also show you, just for my colleague, A8208. I think we'll just call this demonstrative B for the record. It's A8208. We'll 208. And we'll just refer to this as demonstrative B. Is there another
Yes.
document in front of you? Did you hear testimony about this demonstrative earlier today?
Yes.
Does the information reflected on demonstrative B reflect your understanding of the measurements of the injuries on Ms. Mullis's back?
Yes. Well, part of them, only injuries A to B, yes, A
All
and
right.
B.
All right, I'm also going to show you what I guess we'll call demonstrative C, which is A8207. Is that in front of you?
Yes.
And does this reflect your understanding of the measurements of wounds B through F?
Basically the linear distances between each wound.
I'm also going to show you here what we're going to call demonstrative D.
I have a figure up.
All right. Does demonstrative D, third time's a charm, show you the measurements and the depths of wounds B through F?
It is a picture of the back, and it shows me B, C, D, E, and F. It shows me the relative depths of each wound, the linear distances between each of those wounds, and essentially the size of wound.
And does that reflect your understanding of those aspects of the injury pattern on Ms. Mullis's back?
Yes, based on Dr. Cruz's autopsy report. It also shows the abrasion above wound D.
All right, and we've had a lot of testimony about these wounds, so I want to ask you about what aspects of these injuries, I want to ask you about some specific aspects of these injuries. What characteristics of the wounds A through F that we've been talking about are important for your biomechanical analysis?
So we can start superficially, more on top of the skin. And as Dr. Hammers testified today, that we heard also reported in Dr. Cruz's autopsy report, each of the wounds have a specific orientation on the wound. So A, B, and C are oriented 10 to 4 o'clock. D has an orientation that's different, about 8 o'clock to 2 o'clock. And E and F are oriented 11 to 5 o'clock. Additionally, the information about the wounds around each puncture, showing that A and B look more diffuse, as Dr. Hammers described today, and then and then the spacing between each wound. Now we go internally, then the trajectories are important to understand where they start and how they move through the body. Gives an indication about the path that they traveled, and understanding that A to D again has a trajectory that's through the body that's near horizontal to the long axis of the body, so perpendicular to the long axis of the body, though slightly downward, and E and F are sharp upward.
Are there any other aspects or characteristics of those wounds that's important to understand or that was important for you to understand for your biomechanical analysis in this case?
Well, the abrasion as well is something that I consider.
And why is that?
It's just another piece of information.
You heard testimony from Dr. Hammers that in terms of the orientation of these wounds, that she grouped them into wounds that have different orientations. Is that right?
Yes, they self-group. Yeah,
Right.
10 to 4 o'clock, A to C, D's on its own, and E and F.
All right. So in general, in considering your testimony about your biomechanical investigation, you're discussing and considering human anatomy and reaching your decisions in this case. Is that right?
Yes.
And if you're not a doctor, how are you able to do that?
As we discussed, I'm the bridge between engineering and medical, the biological tissue. So I, again, take the same anatomy classes as medical doctors. I take cadaver lab. I've taken cadaver lab. Have access to cadavers through my work at hospitals. I've held human body parts in my hand. I mean, that's part of my job, is to understand the human body and how it fails.
Did you hear some testimony from Dr. Hammers that these injuries, these penetrating injuries, are from blunt penetrating forces?
Yes.
And Is that important to your analysis?
Yes.
Why is it?
Because the mechanism, when I talk about mechanism of injury, I'm talking about the type and direction of forces necessary to cause an injury. We're not talking about magnitude anymore. Oftentimes when I say force, people just think it's a number, but it's much more complicated than that. So type and direction designates a mechanism of injury. And blunt force injuries have different mechanisms than sharp force injuries. So blunt force injuries the tissue fails due to tensile loading. Essentially, you add tension to the tissue and it overloads past its failure point.
Before we go through the possible hypotheses that you considered in this case, I want to talk to you about your investigation of the rake and the clothing in this case. So I think it was your testimony a minute ago that you examined yourself the actual rake, and that's connected with this case. Is that right?
Yes.
Did you take your own photographs and your own measurements of the corn rake?
Yes.
I'm going to show the witness what's been marked as Exhibit 929.
It's up.
All right. Do you recognize Exhibit 929?
Yes.
What is it?
It's a photo I took when I went to inspect the rake.
And is that a true and accurate copy of how the rake looked when you examined it?
Yes, it appears to be.
All right, Your Honor, we'd offer Exhibit 929 into evidence.
Any objection?
No objection, Your Honor.
929 is admitted.
You understand that the investigation into this case suggested that this corn rake caused the injuries in Ms. Mullis's back, is that right?
Yes.
Did anything about your investigation suggest that wasn't true?
No.
All right. You measured the corn rake when you looked at it?
Yes.
And what was it, what if anything did you note about this corn rake that was important for your analysis in this case?
It's important for me to understand the geometric, dimensional, and intrinsic properties of the rake. It has a specific shape, right? So if you stand the rake on its wooden handle on the very end, the tines themselves essentially point sideways. So not quite 90 degrees, a little bit lower than 90 degrees, so closer to the ground. And the spacing between the tines, there's 4 tines, as we've all heard, is a little less than 3 inches. The whole rake is about 37 inches long. It weighs about 2.6 pounds, and the center of mass of the rake is closer to the rake head. So it's basically top heavy. And it's metal. So the head of the rake is metal, the handle is wood, so it is essentially stiff, right? This rake, for me to understand, is a stiff implement relative to the human body. So if you're going to put the two together, it's the human body that's going to deform.
I want to show you as well Exhibit 938. Do you recognize what Exhibit 938 is, Dr. Nye?
Yes.
What is it?
It is a view from the top. So if I'm looking at the tines, and the tines like towards my face, I'm looking at the top of a tine, essentially.
Is the tine in that photograph for, I don't know the term you would use, but in a caliper or a measuring device of some
It is in a
kind?
caliper, yes.
And the tine is in the middle of that caliper?
Yes.
Does the Exhibit 938 truly and accurately depict a more close-up view of one of the tines of the rake at the time you observed it when you examined it?
Yes.
All right, and at this time, Your Honor, I would offer Exhibit 938 into evidence.
Any objection?
No objection, Your Honor.
938 is admitted.
As to this, I'm sorry. Specifically as to the tines of the corn rake, was there anything about the properties of the tines that was important to your analysis?
Yes, looking at the tips. Again, the spacing we talked about, the length, the shape, that it's stiff, but again, the tips themselves were very, they're not sharp, they're not pointy.
And why is the fact that in your view these are not sharp or pointy, why is that important to your analysis here?
Because as we discussed, it has a different mechanism of injury. And you know, they're kind of flat in a sense, just the way Dr. Hammers described today. If I were to compare them to something that people are experienced with, they're essentially kind of like a flathead screwdriver, if you think about it. And if you compare the cross-sectional area of the tip, which is in this picture, for a 1/4 inch wide flathead screwdriver, the tips essentially have a bigger surface area than the tip of a flathead screwdriver.
Why does that matter?
Because in the biomechanical studies, flathead screwdrivers are considered blunt instruments.
Is it, in your assessment, this is blunter than a flathead screwdriver?
This is blunter than a flathead screwdriver based on the measurements, yes. In addition, it's rusty, so it's not smooth, it's not new, so it's not perfectly machined, you know. So again, this is something that has wear and tear on it.
Why does that matter?
Again, wear and tear, just like knives, you know, you use them over time, they get more blunt.
Now, you said in your testimony that the mechanism of injury is different for this type of object. Different from what?
Well, different from sharp force, right? So if you talk about sharp force, tissues fail under compression. So this is basically a tensile loading. So you put something that's blunt against the skin or any kind of material, and you push through it, it basically generates a tensile loading, and it's the tensile loading that causes failure. And why that's important is because in literature, it provides information about the thresholds for human skin to fail under tensile loading.
You're using a lot of scientific terms there. So when you talk about the tensile loading that would cause human skin to fail, in layperson's terms, what does that concept mean?
Like ripping apart. You know, if you were to, you know, again, rip something apart rather than push it together, biological materials are anisotropic, and they have different characteristics and different failure mechanisms and different thresholds for failure depending on how you apply the force to it.
I want to talk more about how those concepts apply in this case, but I want to ask you first about your evaluation of Ms. Mullis's clothing. You had a chance to investigate inspect yourself Ms. Mullis's clothing, is that right?
Yes.
Did you evaluate the different layers of clothing that Ms. Mullis was wearing at the time she was taken to the hospital in this case?
Yes.
And was there anything relevant to your analysis that you noted when you inspected her clothing?
Looking at the holes, again, this is information and evidence that needs to be considered. So the undershirt and the sweatshirt had the same number of holes as Dr. Heimers described today, 5 of which were in the area of the 5 of the wounds. Remember, she has 6 wounds, and there was a cluster of holes in the sweatshirt and the undershirt that was consistent with being caused by a single tine. Additionally, the coat itself had the same area of the location of wounds except for wound D. So again, we have less holes in the clothing than there are in the body.
When you examined the jacket that Ms. Mullis was wearing at the time she was taken to the hospital, how many holes did you see in that jacket?
In the location of the wounds, 5.
And when you examined the clothing, did you make any holes in it?
No.
Can you yourself account, well, let me ask you this. Did you hear testimony from Dr. Cruz that at autopsy they identified 4 holes in a photograph?
Yes, I know that photograph.
All right, and can you personally account for why there is a difference in the number of holes that you saw and the number of holes that were photographed at Dr. Cruz's autopsy?
All I can say is that the photos from the autopsy, that additional hole wasn't as prominent as when I went. When I went, that hole was prominent, and it matched up with the holes on the underclothes.
In general, why were you inspecting the clothing that Ms. Mullis was taken to the hospital in?
Again, it's all information. It's important to consider the physical evidence when running an investigation and making conclusions.
You've talked a second ago about the tensile strength needed to break human skin. In a biomechanical analysis that involves someone wearing clothing, is it important to understand characteristics of the clothing?
Yes, absolutely.
And why is that?
Because different clothing have different properties. Again, it's material science, right? So different materials will have different failure thresholds. And how it applies here is that Ms. Mullis was, as we've heard, was wearing multiple layers of clothes, one being a very thick, I guess it was described as a Carhartt jacket with fleece inside based on my inspection.
I want to go back and show you Demonstrative D. In total, with your understanding of the wound pattern that Ms. Mullis had on her back, the rake that we've been talking about in her clothing, did you draw any conclusions about the mechanism of Ms. Mullis's injuries based on all of that data?
Yes, that it was tensile overload due to penetration from a blunt object.
And in layperson's terms, Dr. Nye, what does that mean?
It means that the skin was pushed apart by something that was not sharp, and when you push it against it, it kind of pulls the skin apart, and it fails under tension. Tension is pulling apart.
Did you hear Dr. Hammers' testimony about the pattern of the wounds on Ms. Mullis's back with respect to the spacing of the wounds on Ms. Mullis's back?
Yes.
And did that give you an understanding of the mechanism by which Ms. Mullis experienced these injuries?
So again, the mechanism is the same. It's going to be tensile failure due to penetration by a blunt object. But biomechanically, when you look about the spacing between the wounds, and I understood that Dr. Hammers testified from a medical standpoint, I'm testifying from an engineering standpoint. Looking again at the materials, the geometry, the intrinsic properties of the rake, intrinsic properties of the rake being it's stiff, it's not malleable relative to the human body. It has essentially fixed spacing between the tines. I can then compare it to the wounds diagnosed on Ms. Mullis's body.
And did you conduct that comparison in this case?
Yes.
And what conclusions, if any, did you draw from that comparison?
Again, similar to the medical side that Dr. Hammers testified to, when you hyperextend, your skin on your back compresses, basically it squeezes together, and when an implement that's stiff like this punctures the skin, you then lay the body flat and flatten out the body. The wounds then are spaced apart. So the wounds are going to be farther apart than the spacing between the tines, which is what we have here.
And so did this biomechanical analysis that you did, coupled with the medical information that you had from Dr. Cruz's autopsy and the spacing information that you had, did that give you an understanding of the position of Ms. Mullis's back at the time that she experienced these injuries?
Yes, that she was slightly hyperextended.
Hyperextended how?
Arching or rotated.
And you're making a motion here, and when you say that she was she hyperextended on both sides?
No, I mean, the wounds are on the primarily middle. One is left, but right side. So she's twisting essentially to her right.
Is it your testimony that, because you've made a motion, I want the, I guess, record to reflect what motion you made. Is the motion that you made a motion that hyperextends your right shoulder back, bringing your elbows closer to your body?
Well, it's basically a slight twist and pulling my shoulders back, kind of like sticking out my chest a little bit.
And pulling your shoulders back, does that decrease the space between, does that decrease some of the spaces in your back when a person does that?
It just compresses the skin. It makes the skin squish together.
And would that dynamic of Ms. Mullis's back being hyperextended when she experienced these injuries, would that explain the spacing of the wounds on her back in the pictures that we've been looking at?
Objection, speculation.
overruled. The witness can answer if she's able.
Yes, I think I've already testified to that the wounds, the spacing on the wounds are bigger than the spaces between the tines. So that means she has to be hyperextended, which compresses her skin together. So when you lay the body flat, the wounds now are spread farther apart in distance.
You heard some testimony from Dr. Hammers about how she would order the way in which Ms. Mullis received these injuries, the order in which they occurred.
Yes.
Do you, from a biomechanical perspective, do you reach the same result or a different result about the order in which these injuries occurred?
No, biomechanically, I agree that A, B, and C occur in pretty much at the same time. I think that based on the analysis, D happens next, and then E and F.
And why is that from a biomechanical perspective?
Based on the clustering, again, if you look at the injury diagnosis, you have the spacing between A, B, and C, and they're in a linear pattern. Additionally, you have the same orientation on the skin, so 10 to 4 o'clock, and you have the same trajectory through the body being horizontal to the long axis of the body. Now you have D, which is much smaller, less deep because it's only 2 inches deep and has a different orientation on the skin. And then you have E and F, which again are clustered together because they have an orientation of 11 to 5 o'clock and the same upward trajectory. Sorry, can I finish?
Oh, go
I'm
ahead.
sorry. I had a pause there.
Sorry.
Additionally, considering the intrinsic properties of the rake being essentially fixed relative to the human body, it's not going to deform or be malleable. E and F are essentially in the middle of her, E, C, and D are essentially in the middle of her back. Those tines cannot be inserted into the body one at a time. It's kind of like if you look at the palm of your hand and you take a fork, you can't enter one prong through your entire palm without having the other 3 prongs contact you. It's similar here. We have a fixed distance between the tines. So E and F, if you're impacting the body with the rake, that a third tine has to happen somewhere, and we don't have another upward trajectory. So those ones can't happen first. Similarly with D, D is essentially close to the middle of the back. You cannot insert one tine at a time. So D is not going to happen first either. So that leaves A, B, and C.
And did you hear testimony from Dr. Hammers about the theory that there could have been tines that were that were inside wounds A and B, and then have tines go into other wounds while the tines in A and B remained in A and B?
Yes.
From a biomechanical perspective, do you have an opinion on whether that's possible?
Yes, that is what happened based on the analysis that I conducted.
All right, so at this point I think your testimony has been that you identified what the injury pattern was as you understood it. You looked at the rake, you looked at Ms. Mullis's clothing. Did you also look at the shed on the Mullis farm?
Yes.
And I want to just show you Exhibit 731.
It's up.
All right. Do you recognize what's depicted in Exhibit 731?
Yes.
What do you understand Exhibit 731 to depict?
It depicts a photo inside the shed where Dr. Hammers was describing one of the walking paths, one of the very few walking paths.
You said that you yourself visited the shed as well.
Yes.
Does Exhibit 731 look like the shed, the inside of the shed, or the area of the shed that's depicted in 731 when you saw it?
It looks like it.
Why did you go to the shed and look at the shed?
Again, it's information to gather, a data point that needs to be considered.
And why does it need to be considered?
Well, if I have all these essentially different hypotheses to test, I want to understand the space in which the people or claimed people involved how they fit relative to the spacing. So now we have to consider anthropometrics, the people claimed to be involved, now we know what the implement looks like and how long it is, and I have different hypotheses to test. So I want to know what space I'm working in. You know, am I working in a giant field or am I working in a box?
Was it was it an assumption that you had at the time you tested your hypotheses in this case that the interior of the shed on the Mullis farm was where Ms. Mullis experienced these injuries?
I don't assume.
I mean, did your opinions depend on the interior of the shed being where she experienced these injuries?
No. If I didn't have, now that I conducted my investigation, if I didn't have information about the shed, my opinions wouldn't change.
All right, so you talked about the scientific method. I think we've talked about your purpose. Have we talked about all of the case materials that you reviewed in this case and that you relied on to reach your opinions?
I believe so. The
All right.
physical evidence, yes.
Okay. And I think we skipped a step, which was developing hypotheses. And I want to use the right term that you use. I think you said that you considered different possible hypotheses. Is that right?
Well, I considered different hypotheses that were proffered in the material I reviewed.
All right. So you mentioned a moment ago that you had to take that when you conduct these kinds of biomechanical investigations, you take all of these case materials into account to conduct your assessments. And before we talk about any of the individual hypotheses that you considered in this case, how did you take all this information to test those hypotheses?
So part of the scientific process, after you've developed a purpose and your hypotheses, reviewed case materials, the next part, and we now talked about the mechanism necessary to cause these injuries, the next step is basically to apply engineering and scientific principles to determine whether or not that mechanism is generated in each hypothesis, if and how.
Just as an aside, the process that, well, not as an aside, I want to ask you this. The process that you're describing, is this the same thing as an accident investigation or an incident investigation?
Yes, incident investigation.
Okay. Is what you are doing when you determine whether different hypotheses are possible, is one of the things that you have to do to decide how much force would be necessary to cause whatever hypothesis or whatever hypothesized mechanism you're considering?
No, not all the time.
And why is that?
Because as I defined earlier, mechanism of injury is the type and direction of forces necessary to cause an injury. That excludes magnitude, right? So we've talked about it a little bit, but types of forces are compression, so pushing together, tensile loading, which is pulling apart, shear loading, which is essentially sliding or transverse to a plane, torsion. Along with those different types of loading, you can have combinations of all those loading. Now, direction is important because the human body and all objects in are three-dimensional. So knowing that each one of those types of forces, as well as any combination of those forces, can be applied to the body in every plane at any increment of that plane. That's what mechanism of injury means. And that's first and foremost. If the mechanism doesn't match, then I don't need to do magnitude. And I've testified before, the analogy is if I'm looking for a red dress in size 5 and I find a blue jumpsuit, I don't care how big it is or what size it is. It doesn't matter.
All right, so to test a particular hypothesis, you're first determining if the type and direction, if the mechanism is possible.
If the mechanism is generated first, yes.
Right, and if the mechanism is generated, do you then determine whether the magnitude of the force is possible?
Again, if it's necessary.
If you have to get there.
If I have to get there. It depends on the case.
Are there any other potential steps in your biomechanical analysis of trying to decide if a particular hypothesis can be proved or not?
Could you please repeat that?
Sure. So in testing a particular hypothesis, you determine if the mechanism fits?
If the mechanism is generated in the hypothesis provided, yes, that I've generated based on the materials.
Right, and you then determine if you need to, if the magnitude of the force could be generated.
If necessary. Again, I'm not going to say I always have to do that, because case by case, I don't need to do that.
Understood. Is there a third potential step? Or are those the two steps?
I don't know what you mean by third potential step.
All right, let's start talking. Let me go on and we'll come back to this issue. To do what you're just describing, to determine the mechanism of the injury, meaning the type and the direction of the injury, what do you have to analyze?
So I already discussed the mechanism necessary for Ms. Mullis's injuries are blunt penetrating forces, which are generated by the rake. We have that she's hyperextended, and we have the orientation the rake has to be in, because we know that the tines are flat. So it has to be somewhat entered when she's hyperextended and rotated. So that gives me a position and orientation of the rake on the surface relative to the injuries. Additionally, looking at the tines, how they are, again, fixed and almost perpendicular to the ground, just slightly downward, if you were to hold the rake up. If you match that up with her trajectories, I now have a position and orientation of how the rake fits into her wounds.
When you are conducting the type and direction analysis, are you considering the laws of physics?
Yes,
And are you considering biomechanical and engineering principles as well?
absolutely.
All right. I want to talk about the possible hypotheses that you considered in this case. Did you consider as a possible hypothesis in this case Dr. Cruz's determination that it was possible that the corn rake was swung into Ms. Mullis's body to cause these injuries?
Yes, and that was what was presented in the trial transcripts for the criminal trial, that it was swung multiple times into her body.
In your biomechanical investigation, were you able to prove or to disprove this hypothesis?
I was able to disprove that hypothesis.
And how did you disprove that hypothesis?
So again, sorry, I keep saying that, but so in every analysis, the engineering fundamentals include Newton's laws of physics, conservation of energy, and I don't know if you want me to go through the laws. I don't need to go through 1, 2, and 3 unless you want me to. But based on Newton's laws of physics and understanding the mechanism in the injury and how the rake is positioned, yes, and in considering the anthropometrics of the people involved, there is about 10.5-inch height difference between Mr. Mullis and Ms. Mullis. So that takes that into consideration.
I want to stop you there. When you talk about their anthropometrics, was that considering the height and weight of each person that would have been involved in this hypothesis?
Yes, and later on I use it further for Ms. Mullis.
Where did you get the height and weight information that you used in your analysis?
The medical records for Ms. Mullis provide me a height and weight, and I actually don't remember where I got Mr.
Your Honor,
Mullis.
I am going to object to the line of questioning as beyond the scope of the report in violation of the rules of civil procedure, as it does not include the study nor the actual evaluation of Ms. Mullis's weight or any of the matters in question here. In fact, I believe that Dr. Nye's report specifically, her second report at page 2, footnote 5 says she doesn't include the actual data and principles, and to date I don't believe we've received the specific data, principles, or force inert evaluations. I'm sorry, the force evaluations at issue for her testimony here. And so the state objects, says it's beyond the scope for purposes of the rules of civil procedure, and therefore falls outside the allowable scope of her expert testimony.
You wish to respond?
I thought that we conferred about this at the break, but we tendered Dr. Nye's biomechanical investigation materials to the state in discovery. I wasn't at the case at this point, so I'll let my colleague handle this, but these materials were disclosed.
They were disclosed last year, Your Honor, and supplemental discovery, I think it was May 27th or June 4th, 2024.
For clarification, Your Honor, is this what you're referencing?
Yes.
I don't know that this is actually, as we conferred in the hallway, I believe we conferred and confirmed that most of it was Dr. Bowley's figures and expressed information, that most of this, I believe, was either copy and pasted for the portions at issue, and again, it was labeled a work in progress and never made a part of the actual expert reports at issue. So based upon the actual calculations, I do believe that we do not and have never received, as Dr. Nye's footnote 5 notes, we have never received the actual information underlying the specific findings.
Judge, may I
If you want to respond, that's fine. Otherwise, we can take a quick break and go off the record so you can look further into what was actually exchanged back on that date.
The applicant and the state share a Dropbox link, and this was provided to them in the supplemental discovery, as I mentioned. There's actually 2 files, and it's not a copy and paste. It's actually Dr. Nye's work in progress of what she was doing and how she came to her analysis of, and I think it also includes like law enforcement and reports and basically her calculations and stuff.
Your Honor, I think this is this is actually, I don't think there's a dispute about what the state received. I think the dispute here seems to be about whether that's a sufficient disclosure. I think that's the issue. I don't think we dispute what was turned over.
Well, I guess I'm hearing a dispute about what was turned over, so.
And we do dispute what was turned over.
Sure.
Commissioner Vaught, you're the witness.
Sure.
Thank you. Dr. Nye, you've previously been deposed and testified in other cases, including at least 24 prior times, correct?
Yes.
Including deposition timeframes recently in the Federal District Court for the Eastern District, I believe, of Texas on an estate case. Is that fair? I believe it's called Ramirez v.
Yes.
Escobedo.
I know that case, yes.
And during that point in time, you also were questioned in your deposition about how you form the notes in question. Do you recall that? How do you take notes when evaluating the case record? Fair?
I don't recall that testimony specifically, and if you could just slow down a little bit, that would be very helpful.
Oh, no problem. I apologize. I believe how do you take notes and prepare the documentation?
So I typically start with a case summary file where I take basically screenshots from material I'm reviewing so I can keep track of where I got what information from. And then I generate an analysis file. And that's basically specific information from the materials I reviewed against, but more condensed. And then I go through an analysis.
And so for your case review file and the information here that would be provided, those photos, for instance, you didn't...
You have to slow down, please.
These photos specifically would be taken at different times, right?
Which photos do you mean?
For instance, what's labeled TRM demonstrating rake position.
So those are not photos. Those are screenshots from a video interview of
And
TRM.
you also included Dr. Hammer's letter, I believe, regarding Ms. Mullis and this case specifically, right?
Yes.
And
Excerpts of it, yes, excerpts of it.
The analysis and information that goes forward from there, those aren't your pictures or those your paragraphs, right?
So again, continuing on, I contain excerpts from Dr. Hammer's report. Those photos are from autopsy, I think, or from Dr. Thompson's photos. And then some inspection photos of the rake.
Including Dr. Bowley's reports, figures, numbers 19, 20, and 21, I believe.
I don't know what Dr. Bowley's figure 19, 20, and 21 are.
I believe they're included in the same section of the paragraph or supplemental discovery that we'd be discussing here. Would it be helpful to see? I believe it's in your binder as well.
Could you just reference the page? I just think...
They're not numbered, but
Yes, they are.
it's the
Oh, I see what you're saying.
fifth from
Yeah,
that.
yes.
Those aren't your figures, correct?
Those are not my figures, but I didn't need them.
Because like you said, you screenshotted the information and included it so you could refer to it later, right?
I screenshotted information. Again, it's the information for me to look back on, so I don't have to go to multiple documents.
And so this document or your file for purposes of the analysis is mostly reflected in footnote 5. Fair?
Well-
Where you didn't include your actual specific data, right?
So from my understanding, footnote 5 I put in there because I was going to be deposed. I had a deposition date for this case, and it was canceled. So I was willing to have my deposition where I could provide my details over a year ago, which I think the state canceled.
So you haven't included those details specifically? here
No,
in your
because I
report?
thought I was going to testify to them.
Thank you, Your Honor. The state submits its objection again. The information is not provided for her own evaluation, and by their own, Dr. Nye's own admission, was left out for purposes of the deposition at hand. And so the state objects in violation of the rules of civil procedure.
However, my
Okay,
report
hold
itself.
on. Right. I was told that the information was provided to you on May something through a Dropbox link. If you need a chance to check and see if you have it, I will provide you with that opportunity. But as of right now, the representation is being made that the materials were in fact provided. So that's where things stand. Whether or not they came directly from the doctor or not is irrelevant to me if you have them. So do you need a chance to check and see if you received them on that date?
We can certainly check, and we can also confirm.
All right. Let's go off the record. Let me know, please, when you've had a chance to do that.
Thank you.
Recess. Thank you.
We have-